I'd like to welcome you to this webinar to introduce the Acute Prescribing in Primary Care Toolkit, which has been developed with the support of a range of teams who have prototyped and tested the tools that will be presented to you today. And I'd like to take a moment just to thank them for their contribution to this work. With over 560 people registered for this event, you'll hear about the benefits and impact of focusing on acute prescribing and the experience of people involved in using the methods and tools that will be presented today. I'm going to hand over now to Rebecca Green, who will introduce herself and share with you her thoughts on being involved in this work. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Belinda. I'm delighted to be here today. So I'm Rebecca Green, I'm a GP in Midlothian, and I'm going to talk to you today about the rationale for the Acute Prescribing Toolkit, some of its benefits as I see them, the improvement journey that toolkit will take you on, and use a real-world example from my own practice to illustrate some of what I'm talking about. So if I can have the next slide, please. So the toolkit has been designed to help primary care multidisciplinary teams, including our pharmacotherapy colleagues funded by the Primary Care Improvement Plan, to safely improve acute prescribing processes in the practice. Next slide, please. But what do we actually mean by an acute prescription? So it's important as you go through the toolkit to really understand this, that the toolkit implies that acute prescription is any prescription without a serial or repeat mandate, i.e. a prescription which is requested inside a consultation by a primary care clinician, for example, for an antibiotic, or outside of consultation by a patient who wants a supply of medication that is not on their repeat prescription or part of a serial prescription at their local community pharmacy. So next slide, please. So the rationale for the toolkit is really to use quality improvement methodology in 3 ways. So processing and producing acute prescription usually forms a large part of our daily workload in GP practice for all our team members, from reception admin through to GPs and practice pharmacists. And quality improvement methodology can be used to help us improve prescribing processes and ensure that the prescribing work that we do is managed by the right member of our team safely and effectively. So effective prescribing processes can do 3 things. Firstly, they can provide patients with safe and timely or even improved access to medication. Effective prescribing processes can also address our prescribing workload issues, and that's important as we remobilise it from COVID and move towards winter and feeling quite overwhelmed with all the new and increasing patient demand that we've got. And thirdly, effective prescribing processes can also make best use of the skills within our primary care multidisciplinary team, so thinking who's the right person to deal with acute prescriptions. Again, next slide, please. So the quality improvement methodology journey has several components for success, starting at the left-hand side of your screen there, from creating the right conditions for change in your system. So that means building the will and commitment from your team to make a change around acute prescribing work. Then you need to be able to understand your system, what's going on properly and what are the opportunities for improvements, and we'll take you through the example with acute prescribing shortly. And then once you've done that, you can develop your aim for improvement. What are you planning to do and improve around your acute prescribing system? Next, it comes testing changes. So after you've identified specific change ideas, how are you going to test and refine those using plan, do, study, act methodology? And then how are you going to measure that improvement to ensure that your change has been improved over time? And lastly, at the far right hand side of that diagram there is how you're going to share that learning and spread to other teams, and that's part of what we're doing today, so that we can share ideas and spread them across other teams' work. So next slide, please. So here I'm going to move on to talking about an example from my own practice using that process that you've just seen about quality improvement methodology. So first of all, we talked about creating the right conditions. So at my practice, this looked like a whole team engagement session in the practice where we got the whole multidisciplinary team together and we talked about acute prescriptions. So what the problems are and what we needed to do about it. And what we discovered as a result of that engagement session was when we looked at our numbers together, we talked about how much workload that was creating us. 25% of all the prescriptions we issue every month are acute prescriptions. And this really helped create awareness amongst the team and a sense of urgency that this is something we needed to tackle and do something about. So having that meeting together also helped us understand how we could make best use of the team together. So who does what job as part of the acute prescribing system, and how could we change that? Where are the opportunities for improvement? How can we make best use of each other? And thirdly, thinking about how we improve access to medications for patients. What we discovered as part of our discussions together and the process mapping that we did next, that I'm going to talk to you about in a moment, is that it was taking a day longer for patients to obtain an acute prescription from our practice than it did to get a repeat prescription. So next slide, please. So understanding our systems, what we did is looked at the whole process of acute prescribing. So we mapped that out. I'm not going to talk you through the detail on that process map there, because that is part of the detail. But what I want you to understand is that the process map is really important to this piece of work. So understanding in detail what your whole system is around acute prescriptions. And this is really, really helpful to identify the issues that you have. For us, you can see the hazard labels on the process map. It was around a lack of consistency in our admin processes and a lack of consistency in our GP decision making about how we handled acute prescriptions. And our second piece of planning that we did to help understand our system was to use a Pareto chart. So this basically just tells you which are the most common medicines that we prescribed by acute prescription. So we looked at a single month here, for example, and the medications at the left-hand side of the chart, highest on the bar chart there, are the most commonly prescribed acute prescriptions. And we decided to focus our attentions on those most commonly prescribed medicines. So we had quick wins and we had maximal impact from the work that we did. Next slide, please. So having done all this planning work and understanding our system, we were then able to name our improvement aim and what we were going to do about it. So we decided that we were going to reduce our acute prescriptions to less than 20% by August 22, because we knew our baseline was 25%, and that felt realistic and it felt achievable. And to do that, based on some of the resources from Healthcare Improvement Scotland, we decided that we were going to develop and test a new permissible repeats policy. And what do I mean by a permissible repeats policy? That is guidance for our practice team about moving acute prescriptions onto a repeat prescription for a limited number and amount of time before review. And we decided to target that new repeats policy about those most commonly prescribed acute drugs that we'd identified from our Pareto chart. So next slide, please. And what we did was test and retest the permissible repeats policy using plan, do, study, act cycles. So we decided what we were going to do. We planned that out. We used small-scale tests of change. We stopped and reflected on each of those, and then we amended our permissible repeats policy to take into account the changes that had been identified during each study cycle. And we did 3 PDSA cycles to get our permissible repeats policy to where it is now. and that involved the whole team with opinions and feedback from our pharmacists, from our admin staff and from our GPs. Next slide, please. And what did we get as a result? Well, this chart here shows the percentage of all our prescriptions as acutes, and you can see that we had quite a long baseline period to compare to, with an average percentage of prescriptions as acutes about 25% until April 22, when we started testing our permissible repeats policy. And what you can see that the percentage of acutes dropped and then has continued to drop right down to August 22. So we're not down to target yet of 20%, but we're down to 21%, and so we're not far off, and we're hoping this will continue to improve. But what does that mean in reality? It's all very well talking about percentages, but that 4% reduction from baseline is equivalent to about 300 less acute prescriptions every month. So that is palpable. Our GPs are feeling it, they're feeling the benefit, our admin staff are feeling the benefit of that because patients can get their prescriptions sooner. So this is beginning to have some real benefit for our team, and the numbers will hopefully continue to improve as we go forward. So next slide, please. So just to recap, that his toolkit will provide you with some of the tools and resources to do pieces of work similar to what I've just described as an example here, but predominantly to remember to safely improve those prescribing processes going forward using robust methodology to test and check your processes and that they are impactful and sustainable. So thank you. I'll hand back to Alison.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm Alison Serran. I'm a Senior Improvement Advisor, and I've been leading the acute prescribing programme. And I'm just going to talk to you a bit about how we developed the toolkit, and then some tips for navigating the toolkit and the resources that are in it. So the toolkit was developed through the Acute Prescribing Learning Network. We recruited teams to the network in November 2021. We had 75 practices arranged into 11 teams, and those teams were in groups by health and social care partnerships, so usually one, occasionally two partnerships, but so that the pharmacotherapy services as well as the GP practices were involved in working on improvement projects. For some teams that was at HSCP level or occasionally at board level, and for others it was at practice level. So the toolkit has been designed so the resources can be used for either approach, so they could be used in one practice or on a bigger scale. The first workshop that we held in the Acute Prescribing Learning Network was in February 2022. There was a bit of a delay due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and that meant that we had quite a compressed timeline for our teams. But despite that, we were able to make some really good progress, as you've seen from Rebecca's practice, and we had loads of feedback and learning, which has shaped the resources that are in the toolkit. And I just want to thank all of those teams and practices for their contributions and their enthusiasm in participating in the network. And you'll find their case studies, learning summaries, quotes and resources throughout the toolkit to really enhance the tools that are contained in it. We can go on to the next slide, Elaine. So this slide shows our teams. So you can see that they're from across quite a lot of the country, and I think really importantly as well that they're from a wide range of contexts. So we had city centre practices, but also practices in rural areas and island HSCPs all participating in the network to test the resources. And that means that we've got a broad range of contexts for the tools and the examples that you'll find in the toolkit. So then if we can go to the next slide, I'm just going to give you a bit of information about how to navigate the toolkit. So as Rebecca said, it's built around the steps of the quality improvement journey, and designed so that you can work through the toolkit stage by stage, and it will guide you through going through those steps and taking a systematic approach to your project. But the resources are also able to be used flexibly, so it's possible to pick up one of the sections and use some of the resources. And we've also included some specific change ideas that were tested by the network teams and were the ones that the network teams found to be most helpful that you can take and test in your own context. To go to the next slide. So when you open the toolkit, this is the home page. The links throughout the toolkit are highlighted in blue and they're bold. So in the main text of this page, you can see Essentials of Safe Care is a link. It's highlighted in blue. The toolkit's an online resource hosted on the iHub website, so there's no button to click to download the whole thing. The resources are all hosted on the web page. And then on the right-hand side here, but if you're using a mobile device, it might be at the bottom. There are links to all the different sections of the toolkit. So there's different steps of the improvement journey, and you can click on those to go to the step that you're interested in. So we go on to the next slide. Once you click on one of those stages, you'll land on a page that looks a bit like this. This is the one for understanding your system. And the main text gives you the information about what that stage involves, some tools, and other things that you might need to help you work through that step. There's also throughout the toolkit some quotes from our network teams. You see one in green there at the bottom. Then again, on the right-hand side or at the bottom on some mobile devices are all the links to resources in the toolkit. We've organized these into several sections. So the top section there are the Acute Prescribing Tools. So those are some tools that have been developed specifically for this toolkit, but also some other important national documents that we think you really need to focus on when working on acute prescribing. So for example, here, there's some links to the Scottish Therapeutics Utility as well. The second section is local examples. So those are the stories and the resources from our network teams. And then the bottom section are the NHS Education for Scotland pages on the quality improvement tools included throughout the toolkit. So then if we go on to the next slide, once you click through to the resources, these are a few examples. So from that previous page, you could click through to see the learning summary from Rebecca's practice that's on the left. And then on the other side, the tool that could help you make your own chart, Pareto chart, to see what are the most important things to focus on. And then the NES QI page about the same tool. I'm going to hand over to Gareth, who's going to talk a bit more about some of those tools in the Understanding Systems section.
Thank you, Alison. I'm Gareth Fitzgerald. I'm one of the improvement advisors here at Healthcare Improvement Scotland, and very happy to have the chance to talk to you a little bit about the Understanding Systems section of the toolkit. So if we go on to the next slide, just a quick overview of some of the topics covered in the toolkit around understanding your systems. There's our STEW data, Pareto charts, as we've touched upon already, process maps, and also the staff, patient, the user experience. Those are all covered with their own sections within the Understanding Your Systems part of the toolkit, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of aspects within it in this section here. So if we go on to the next slide, we mentioned STEW data from the Scottish Therapeutics Utility. Basically, it's a piece of software that presents data straight from the practice clinical system. What we felt was most relevant during the course of our acute prescribing learning network were two of the tabs, the dashboard tab and the repeatable acutes tab. The dashboard tab is pretty straightforward. It just has the overall numbers of acute items, repeat items, serial items that are being issued from the practice each month. Very useful for a little bit of understanding the greater context, the numbers. The repeatable acutes tab displays patients who've been having the same identical acute item repeatedly over a set period of time. You can see in here there's a drop-down tab that shows 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. And a lot of practices over the course of the network have found that information very useful. So if we move on to the next slide, the way they've been using that repeatable acutes data is, as we've already alluded to, using Pareto charts as a diagnostic tool. By putting that repeatable acutes data into a Pareto chart, they're able to see the areas that are causing the highest amount of workload pressure within their prescribing system. And we've included, as Alison showed in the previous slides, a Pareto chart tool that practices can make their own. So I'm just going to take you through that very quickly. So on the next slide, when you download the Pareto chart tool, you'll get this page, which has guidance on how to use it. You'll see at the very bottom is a red circle around the guidance, a few simple instructions on how to download it, how to enable it, and then how to fill it in. On the next page is the actual data input page. So that's where you'd collect those numbers in Stew, pop them in, put in your name, list size, the date that this was done. And then if you go on to the next slide, the tool will produce for you a Pareto chart showing those BNF categories and what's causing the most workload within your practice. At the bottom, there's also a little summation of the data showing the BNF chapters and the total and the percentage that they're providing. We've seen with those Pareto charts, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, on the left, those larger categories, the possibility of quick wins or addressing areas of the most concern. But we've also seen with practices who perhaps aren't in the right situation when it comes to capacity or resource just yet to take on a large piece of work, that they've gone a little bit further to the right and looked at those useful many and thought, could we test some changes in these smaller categories? And once those changes are embedded, can we adapt them and embed them and move towards those areas that are causing still the largest areas of workload once we're in a position with resource or capacity that we feel we can address those. So if we move on to the next slide, because we've been collecting data at the start as we understand our systems, it really helps us to think about what we're going to measure as we move on with our improvement projects. And that's where the value of a good data plan can come in. If you've been collecting data at the start, you might have an idea of who's going to collect data moving onwards, whether it be weekly or monthly, where they'll collect it and how. Will it be from Stew? Will it be audits, etc., that they do within the practice? So value of data planning mentioned. We've also in the toolkit provided a run chart tool for that ongoing measurement to make it easy to display how the improvement efforts are going. So if we move on to the next slide, within the toolkit, we've been fortunate enough that Ker Practice from Greater Glasgow and Clyde collaborated with us on a case study. We've been hoping to have them here to talk about it today, but unfortunately scheduling made that impossible. So I hope I can do justice to the work that they've done. They were part of the network. They joined because they felt that their prescribing workload was getting to the unmanageable state, that they didn't really know what to do about it. And what they did at the start, during the network, we had a few data sharing exercises where we asked some practices to volunteer to share a bit of data to have a look at maybe variation overall numbers. So if we go to the next slide, this was the first data sharing exercise. 10 practices shared their acute data over time. And this was very much the impetus for Ker Practice to start thinking strongly about what they wanted to do, because they were looking at numbers between 6,000 and 7,000 acutes per month. And this definitely created a sense of urgency for the practice. But the important thing is, whilst it created a sense of urgency, it didn't create a sense of panic. They wanted to look further into those numbers and really understand them before they started looking at any possible change ideas and implementing those change ideas. So if we go on to the next slide, once again, they looked at doing a Pareto chart of their repeatable acutes, and they found that the BNF chapter central nervous system, CNS, was causing roughly 40% of their repeatable acutes workload. And with that feeling that because their acutes list was being extended and was almost unmanageable every day, they felt this would be the ideal first place to have a look at that, to think about what they were doing. They dug a little bit deeper into that CNS and realized that it was mostly antidepressants and painkillers that were the ones that were being repeatedly issued to patients. So if we go on to the next slide, some of the activities that they undertook, they dug a little bit further into the data. They looked at those acutes issued out with consultation that Rebecca alluded to earlier, and found that for November 2021, for example, 74% of those acutes had been issued out with consultation. They also looked for change ideas at introducing a practice prescribing policy. They noted that to do that from the ground up, to just build it straight away would be quite an arduous task. The value of the network was that resources were being shared widely, and there was a policy there that whilst they wouldn't adopt it wholesale because they had to take into account their own behaviours and philosophies and the needs of their patients, they were able to adapt it to represent their view and their beliefs going forward. They also then commenced, once the policy was in place and approved by clinicians, some targeted reviews of patients issued repeatable acutes. So if we move on to the next slide, we've got some data over time, a run chart that's annotated with some of the activities that took place along their improvement journey. So again, we had a good run-in with baseline data, set a median. February was the first workshop and the data collection exercise, and then the policy being agreed and the medication review start. And we can see that downward trend in acute items. The practice, I've been in discussions with them, they've said that the GPs can certainly feel it in terms of the, as I mentioned, the acutes list being extended or being unmanageable. They felt much more in control of that. Admin are taking responsibility as well for helping with that. They're also looking in the future to introduce more change ideas when they see how this all shakes out. So if we go on to the next slide, just want to quickly thank our DMBI team for producing the Pareto chart tool and also the run chart tool. And I do want to thank Ker Practice for sharing with us their enthusiasm and the great work that they've been doing. And with that said, I'd like to hand over to Fiona to talk about testing changes.
Thank you, Gareth. So I'm Fiona McGurr, an improvement advisor with the primary care portfolio, and I'll cover testing changes. So once your team have considered your current system and your data, you need to decide which change ideas should be prioritised and think about how you'll know they'll make a difference. So if we go on to the next slide, please. A number of change ideas for acute prescribing have been identified and tested by teams across Scotland, and these are certainly not the only options, but they are the key ones that we feel you need to consider. So changes you make to your acute prescribing system are often co-dependent. You will therefore likely need to target multiple areas over time. The cumulative impact of various small changes can be greater than one larger test of change. And the toolkit, as mentioned, encourages you to use plan, do, study, act cycles to test each change idea. And as Gareth said, you'll need to decide how you'll measure to know if things are working. So I'm going to give a quick rundown of the change ideas in the toolkit. My aim is purely to show you the range of associated resources provided in the toolkit to encourage you to check them out for yourself. So if we move on to the next slide. The first idea presented in the toolkit is prescribing plans. This means developing a template or system to record key information and patient notes, and this helps members of your multidisciplinary team to understand the intentions of the original prescriber. So one of the teams who tested this idea really sum up in the quote on the screen, the need to turn off the tap of the problem and not just keep bailing out the water. We recommend that teams consider using the acronym WAWEN, which was designed by NHS Forth Valley to structure their prescribing plans, and you can see it on the screen, and more information is available in a case study available in the toolkit. So moving on to the next slide, change idea 2 is around requesting prescriptions, and your protocols for requesting prescriptions should be reviewed regularly to ensure safe and efficient ordering and processing of medications. I'm sure many of you will have seen various significant changes over the past couple of years in this area, and it is worth reviewing to ensure work is directed to the most appropriate member of your team and procedures are really clear for staff and patients. We have a learning study. We have a learning summary in the toolkit from Ladywell Medical Centre West, and they introduced an acute prescribing request slip to support their prescription request procedure. And this was for internal use rather than patient facing, and it sits alongside the third change idea, which if we move on to the next slide, is medication reviews. And this is about ensuring a robust medication review procedure to instill the confidence in your prescribers to issue medications on repeat rather than acute prescription. The Scottish Government's polypharmacy guidance includes a 7-step medication review, which provides a clear structure for initiating new treatments and reviewing existing medications. And we're very thankful to NHS Highland who have used this guidance to structure templates for both EMIS and Vision clinical systems. And there are screenshots, installation instructions, and files to install both EMIS and Vision templates available in the toolkit. So on to the next slide. A change idea that overarches all of these changes is having a really good prescribing policy, and a prescribing policy lays out what the expectations are for prescribing within your team. NHS, Ayrshire and Arran introduced a board-wide prescribing policy, which is available in the toolkit, and you'll hear very shortly from Keith McClure from NHS Borders about how they've gone about doing the same thing. So a quote from the Ker Practice that Gareth spoke about earlier was, "We were able to produce a prescribing policy from resources shared by other boards, and I'm eternally grateful I did not have to start from scratch," which Gareth alluded to earlier. I think that reflects the whole toolkit. None of what we're suggesting is new. We're just trying to pull learning and resources together to ensure you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So some key factors in prescribing policies are optimising your use of serial and permissible repeat prescriptions, and further information on implementing serial prescriptions is available through the Serial Prescription Toolkit, which was published last year, and it's linked in this new acute toolkit. So permissible repeats, which Rebecca mentioned earlier, otherwise known as limited repeat prescriptions, are a useful option to consider, particularly as a first step away from acute prescribing. And the permissible repeats function within clinical systems allows you to limit the number of prescriptions that can be issued before a review is required. This has been really successfully used by many of the teams involved in testing, including for combined oral contraceptives, antidepressants, and many other drug classes that came out in the Pareto chart, which leads me on to standard operating procedures, or SOPs. So we're on to the next slide. Developing a SOP so that there is an agreed way of doing things for a specific drug class or subclass can help really minimise the variation between your prescribers and increase confidence to issue stable medications on repeat or permissible repeat. And a template SOP has been developed and is available in the toolkit. Which takes us on to the next slide. So last but not least is care navigation and self-care, and using care navigation to signpost appropriate patients to self-care resources and community pharmacy can support safe reduction in the number of acutes issued. The existing care navigation 10-step guide is linked to within the toolkit alongside supporting material available from NHS Inform. So hopefully on that whistle-stop tour, you can see there are lots of different options and resources open to your team. And as I said, it's likely to be a combination that is required. I would encourage you to understand your own system and use your data to know which are the most worthy of your time and effort. But I will pass you over to Keith McClure, a lead pharmacist in NHS Borders, who will explain their piece of work on prescribing policies and what they have done.
Thanks, Fiona. That's really useful. Yeah, so Keith McClure, I'm the lead pharmacist for primary care in the Borders. I was originally involved in setting up our pharmacotherapy team, but since then we've had a reprofiling, so I've actually handed this baton on now, which is an added bonus for me. So the aim of this was to set up a prescribing policy for the whole board. The thought was that really, well, we're probably about the right size. We've only got 23 GP practices. It's about 100, I think it's about 106 GPs. And we're probably a good size to be able to find the one perfect way. Given the variation in the 100 different GPs who all like things done the way they like them, there's certainly plenty of variation to start with. But there has to be one good way, was my thought. We're pretty rural. We're not quite Highland rural, where I was working before, but we do have our moments. The practice size, the average is 5,500, but actually practically we've got 3, to us, giant practices of over 11,000, and then the rest of them are averaging about 4,500, so relatively small practices in the main. And every practice has every demographic available. The one common theme is that we're generally quite an elderly population, significantly older than the rest of the country. If we could jump on to the next slide, please. So the aim was to reduce variation. As I say, there has to be one perfect way, and also for the pharmacotherapy team, with the request for a 50-week service, it needed to be a fairly consistent approach when we were jumping from one practice to another, or if we were ever going to be able to get to that point. We can't have folk going to a new practice and then having to learn a whole new way of doing things for the sake of a week. So it was trying to find the best way and then be able to get on. recognised very early that this is a huge undertaking, and that it would be little ditty steps all the way, and that we had to be quite pragmatic, that it needs to be it'll be a slow process and it'll take a long time. So that was the biggest kind of thing for us to recognise as a team. If we jump on to the next slide, please. So we had copies of practice policies from a previous prescribing list. That ranged from a single sheet of A4 up to a 30+ page monster document. Fortunately, the body of the Kirk, the kind of the middle bit of the normal curve, everyone seemed to have taken the template from the BMA and had adapted that to varying degrees. We took what we considered very high-handed style, or the best one, the one that best suited our needs as pharmacists about to take on, or pharmacy team taking on this project. And then we've adapted it slowly over time. We made the first changes and adaptations and rolled it really back to that first practice, and then we've been gradually working it out before it was eventually sent to all practices as something to aspire towards, rather than do this by next Wednesday. So it was done fairly gradually. We've since then had some specific mapping exercises. I think we've been to 5 practices and mapped out their current process, and then what we would need to, and had a look at what we would need to change to be able to process that. And as the PDSA cycle, it's just repeated and repeated, lots of little tweaks as we go, and lots of little changes, and republishing, even for minor changes, just needing to change that again. Next slide, please. So the benefits for the pharmacotherapy team, we've been able to make little changes as we go. It's being moved towards a functional system that supports the whole MDT, and kind of being able to process that. We've also got in mind the kind of, it's allowed us to make changes as developments in IT come along. So digital evolution is how I phrased it there, but I mean the publication recently from NSS, new GPIT systems from kind of 23-24 in terms of the digital platforms and digital prescribing. So that will result in more changes again. And we recognise that we need to be a bit chilled about it, a bit zen, and that it will be a never-ending series of cycles. The PDSA cycles will just carry on. So next slide. We recognise we're pretty ambitious. It's a huge task, if nothing else, to bring along everybody with us. The expectation was always it was going to be a gradual drift towards what we were aiming for, rather than a wholesale change, and that will come as the pharmacotherapy teams expand and grow, and we'll be able to pull that along. Gareth's already spoken to you about the data stuff, and Stu's been really useful in gathering that, and we'll just kind of keep going along. And we're always looking out for feedback from the GP practices as to what's working and what's not, and do we need to make other changes. I think we're on to the last slide, please. So yeah, we're just going to keep repeating and keep developing it as we go. And for kind of next steps, more of the same, I guess. I expect we'll end up with a complete revision when it comes to the new IT systems, and then into the digital prescribing stuff. And after Fiona's last little talk there, I'm going to double check that we've added in the HIS toolkits, both of them now, the serial one and the acutes, and make sure that people are making it as slick as we can. So that's us. Thank you. I think I'm passing on to Alison.
Thanks, Keith. So we're coming towards the end of our webinar now, but wanted to share with you a little bit of what the impact is of this work. As I said earlier, the Acute Prescribing Learning Network didn't hold its first workshop until February 2022, so we're not at a stage yet where it's possible to fully evaluate the impact of the changes our teams have made. We have actually started to review some prescribing data across the network, but submission of that's ongoing, so it's not something we're able to report on just yet. But over the next few months, we'll be continuing to evaluate the impact of this work, and would be really, really pleased to hear from any of you as well about the impact that using the toolkit has in your context. But for today, I wanted to share with you a little bit of early impact data from our network, looking first at a little bit of prescribing data, then at some themes in patient feedback that the teams have had, and then some quotes from staff, so some staff feedback. So we can go on to the next slide. First of all, looking at some prescribing data, many of our network teams set as their aim a numerical aim around reducing the number of acute prescriptions they were issuing, either overall or for some of them in a particular BNF category or for a particular medication. The chart here shows data for one practice in the Western Isles, and their project focused on moving patients who were on combined oral contraceptives onto repeat prescriptions. And although it's fairly early days for this project, you can see that the number of acute prescriptions they're issuing per month has reduced. And this is the total number of acute items per month. And actually, we can see a shift that started just before they started working on the project, which is a useful reminder as well that sometimes just starting to engage with the issues and starting to think about it and make some plans and create some conditions for improvement, even doing that can start to have an impact on the workload. It's always really important to be aware of the context when reviewing your data. So this data set is interesting there because you can see there's a little spike in June 22. And when we went back to the team, we said actually there's always an increase in the summer in the number of prescriptions for this practice because there are temporary residents on the islands. So we can go on to the next slide. This slide is data from NHS Forth Valley, and we're really, really grateful to NHS Forth Valley for joining the Acute Prescribing Learning Network because they'd actually been working on a project for a long time and really joined just so that they would be able to share their learning with the rest of us, and that's been really valuable. But that also means that they have data that goes back much further, and this data looks at their progress over the last couple of years. And it shows the change in the average weekly number of acute prescriptions issued across all their practices, and then on a quarter by quarter basis. And as you can see, there's been a reduction, but also you can see that context piece that there are some dips and some peaks, and particularly obvious that there's a dip right near the beginning of this chart that's associated with the COVID-19 restrictions in 2020. Looking at this data over this kind of timescale, it's also really important for us to recognise that without the intervention, it's likely the number of prescriptions issued would have risen over this time in line with the increased demand for services and population factors. So the fact that a population across the country is getting older, which makes it really important to have a note of caution around the data. It can be really useful, and the reduction in acute prescriptions is a great aim to have and a useful way of understanding whether changes are having an impact. But it's also really important to look at those other factors. So what are people saying, and what's the qualitative data about the impact of your project? So we can go on to the next slide. Our practices and teams in the network received some ad hoc feedback from patients, and we've collated that to pull out a few themes, a few things that patients were saying across more than one place. And this top set of things really are practicalities, organisation things, so that people are having better experience of ordering their medications, finding the processes easier to understand, and experiencing fewer delays when they're collecting medication. Because of that, as Rebecca was saying, that sometimes it's quicker than processing requests for acute prescriptions. And then there's also really importantly that patients are also recognising that they might be having more regular reviews of their medication. It's obviously really, really important for their safety, But also people are saying makes them feel more in control of their medications and of managing their health. So then finally on the impact, a few quotes from staff from some of our teams. So the first one, thinking about workload for their admin team, that they were finding the new processes much quicker. Secondly, thinking about both GP workload being reduced, the workload associated with acute prescribing, and also that the service has improved for patients and has increased their safety because those medication reviews are taking place. And then finally, a really important point about what's come out of the project is better communication between pharmacy team and GPs and an improvement in that relationship, which is obviously really vital as we continue working on implementing the pharmacotherapy services. So there's some of our early impact data, and as I said, it'd be really great to hear in the coming months about the impact of any projects that you go on to do using the toolkit and the resources in it. And I'm just going to pass over to April for the concluding a couple of slides for our webinar.
Thanks very much, Alison. Yeah, I'm April Masson. I'm the portfolio lead for primary care within Healthcare Improvement Scotland. So just before we finish this session, I want to talk a little bit about next steps. So the next phase of this work is going to be included in a new programme being led by Healthcare Improvement Scotland, focusing on access. Where practicing clusters together or separately will be invited to join one of 3 7-week improvement sprints between October and April of next year. So in this programme, teams will have access to hands-on practical quality improvement support to look at their data, to have a look at their priorities and test changes. And we anticipate that there might be some practices, probably quite a few practices, will want to have a look at acute prescribing as part of this programme. So the toolkit will really form the basis of that programme in terms of people who want to work on that element of their access challenges. And then, so just to let you know, the information about that programme is going to come out in the next few weeks. Also, just to let you know that we're open to answering any questions from today. Any of the speakers here are happy to answer questions. So if you want to submit questions to the email address that's on the screen, we'll gather those together and kind of collate them into frequently asked questions and put those on our website. And next slide, please. Finally, I just want to once again thank the network teams who helped to develop the toolkit. I want to thank Rebecca and Keith who presented today and took time out of their day to do that. Thank you. And also to the team who in the primary care portfolio who organised this session and put all the time in over the last year to support the teams within this programme. And thank you for joining us in the session. And we hope that you leave with some insights into the toolkit and that you also take a chance to have a look at the toolkit and that it helps you in your efforts to improve acute prescribing in your context. So thanks very much.